Hey there, welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. I'm here to guide you through tonight's collection of unsettling tales. Before you settle in too deeply, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find value in what we create here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop that in the comments. It helps me understand this strange community we're building together across time zones and dark hours. Now, find your comfortable position. Let the world outside fade away, and let's begin. Story 1. The appointment card had been in Marcus Webb's wallet for 3 weeks before he finally noticed it. He discovered it on a Thursday morning while searching for his insurance card at the pharmacy, wedged between his driver's license and a receipt from a restaurant he couldn't remember visiting. The card was cream-colored, heavy stock, with elegant typography that belonged to an earlier era. Dr. Vivian Marchwood, it read, psychiatric consultation, and below that, an address on Havering Street, followed by a date and time. Tomorrow, Friday, at 4 in the afternoon. Marcus stood at the pharmacy counter, his prescription forgotten, staring at the card with growing unease. He had never scheduled an appointment with any psychiatrist, had never heard of Dr. Vivian Marchwood, had certainly never been to Havering Street, which he was fairly certain didn't exist in Portland. Yet here was the card, in his wallet, in his handwriting on the back. A single word in his own cramped script, remember. The pharmacist cleared her throat, and Marcus realized he'd been standing there for nearly a minute, frozen. He completed his transaction mechanically, his mind cycling through possibilities. Had he made the appointment during one of his episodes? The blackouts had been getting worse over the past 6 months. Hours would disappear from his memory, leaving him in unfamiliar parts of the city with no recollection of how he'd arrived. His last therapist had suggested stress, overwork, the cumulative weight of his job as a social worker dealing with the city's most damaged individuals. But scheduling appointments he couldn't remember, writing cryptic notes to himself. That implied something more serious, something that made his hands shake as he walked to his car. That night, Marcus dreamed of a waiting room. The details were precise enough to suggest memory rather than imagination. Green wallpaper with a pattern of ferns, their fronds curling in ways that created almost faces when you looked at them peripherally. A coffee table holding magazines from the 1970s, their pages yellowed and brittle. 3 chairs upholstered in worn velvet the color of dried blood. And a door, heavy oak, with a brass nameplate that caught the light from a floor lamp that shouldn't have been able to cast shadows in quite that way. He woke at 3 in the morning, his pillow soaked with sweat, absolutely certain he'd been in that room before. The certainty felt like a stone in his chest, solid and cold. Friday arrived with autumn rain that turned Portland's streets into mirrors reflecting a gray sky. Marcus told himself he wasn't going to the appointment. Told himself he'd spend the afternoon catching up on case files, maybe finally returning his sister's calls. But at 3:30 he found himself in his car, typing the Havering Street address into his phone's GPS. The app couldn't find it. He tried variations. Havering Avenue, Havering Lane, Havering Court. Nothing. He expanded the search radius to include the entire metro area. Still nothing. The street didn't exist, which should have been a relief. Should have been permission to go home, order takeout, spend the evening pretending everything was normal. Instead, Marcus started driving. No destination in mind, just movement through the rain-slicked streets, letting his hands make turns without consulting his conscious mind. The technique had worked before during his blackouts. Some part of him seemed to know where he'd been, even when his waking self had no memory of it. 40 minutes later, he found himself in a neighborhood he didn't recognize. Old Portland, the kind of area that had somehow avoided both renovation and demolition, existing in a state of elegant decay. Victorian houses with peeling paint and sagging porches. Trees so old their roots had buckled the sidewalks into treacherous waves of concrete. And there, on a street corner where the sign had rusted into illegibility, was a building that made his breath catch. 3 stories, narrow, built in a style that suggested it had been designed for some specific purpose and later converted to office space. The green awning over the entrance was faded but unmistakable, and beside the door, a brass plate. Dr. Vivian Marchwood, psychiatric consultation, by appointment only. Marcus sat in his car, engine running, windshield wipers beating a rhythm that sounded like warning. He could leave, should leave, drive back to his apartment and throw away the mysterious appointment card and pretend he'd never found it. But the word written on the back kept surfacing in his mind. Remember. What was he supposed to remember? He turned off the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rain-steady percussion on the car's roof. Marcus walked to the entrance, his shoes splashing through puddles that reflected the building in ways that made it look taller than 3 stories, deeper than any structure should be. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood in the doorway, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a style that belonged to an earlier decade. Her clothing was similarly anachronistic, a gray wool suit that could have been worn in 1955 or last Tuesday, depending on context. But her eyes were what held Marcus. They were the clearest blue he'd ever seen, and they looked at him with an expression of profound recognition. "Marcus Webb," she said. Her voice had a quality that made it hard to determine if she was pleased or disappointed. "You're exactly on time. I'm Dr. Marchwood. Please, come in." The waiting room was identical to his dream. Every detail matched. The green wallpaper, the vintage magazines, the 3 velvet chairs. Marcus felt his knees weaken. He'd been here before. He knew it with a certainty that bypassed rational thought. "You remember," Dr. Marchwood said. "It wasn't a question. You're starting to remember." She led him through the oak door into an office that seemed larger than the building's exterior could accommodate. Bookshelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with volumes whose spines bore titles Marcus couldn't quite read. They seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them, the letters rearranging themselves into different words. A desk dominated the center of the room, and its surface empty except for a leather-bound notebook and an antique fountain pen. 2 chairs faced each other across an oriental rug that looked like it depicted a map of somewhere that wasn't quite Earth. "Please, sit," Dr. Marchwood said, settling into one of the chairs with a sigh that suggested she'd been standing for a very long time. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I'm afraid our time is more limited than you realize." Marcus sat, his body moving without conscious direction. "I don't understand," he said. "I don't remember making this appointment. I don't remember being here before. But I have been here, haven't I?" 7 times, Dr. Marchwood confirmed. "Once a month for the past 7 months. You come, we talk, you leave, and then you forget. Not immediately. The forgetting takes about 3 days. By the 4th day, you have no memory of our sessions at all, until something triggers a fragment, a feeling of familiarity, and you find the appointment card again." "Why?" Marcus's voice cracked on the word. "Why would I forget?" "Because that's what you asked me to help you do," Dr. Marchwood said gently. 7 months ago, you came to me in crisis. You'd discovered something about yourself, about your past, that you couldn't bear to know. You begged me to help you forget. And I did. But forgetting, Mr. Webb, is not the same as erasing. The truth remains, buried, but not gone, and it keeps trying to surface. Marcus felt cold spreading through his chest. What truth? What did I want to forget? Dr. Marchwood opened the leather notebook. The pages were covered in handwriting. Marcus's handwriting. Session notes, apparently. Documenting conversations he couldn't remember having. She turned the book so he could see, though the words seemed to writhe on the page, resisting his attempts to read them. "You're a social worker," she said. "You specialize in cases involving children removed from dangerous homes. Over the past 5 years, you've been responsible for placing 43 children in foster care or residential facilities. Your work has been exemplary. You've saved lives, Mr. Webb, pulled children from situations that would have destroyed them." Marcus nodded slowly. This much he knew. This much he remembered. His caseload was heavy, the work emotionally devastating, but he was good at it. He had a gift for seeing through parents' lies, for recognizing signs of abuse that others missed. "But then you started having dreams," Dr. Marchwood continued. "Dreams where the children you'd saved appeared to you, except they weren't grateful. They were accusing you of something, and when you woke, you'd find objects that shouldn't have been there. A child's drawing on your nightstand, a small toy in your jacket pocket, evidence of visits you couldn't remember." The cold in Marcus's chest spread to his limbs. He did remember the dreams. Had been having them for years, actually. Children's faces pressing against windows, their mouths moving soundlessly, their eyes reflecting something that looked like betrayal. "You began investigating," Dr. Marchwood said, "checking up on the children you'd placed, making unscheduled visits to their foster homes and group facilities. And what you discovered," she paused, her expression complicated. "What you discovered was that you had perfect instincts, Mr. Webb. Every child you'd removed from their biological family had indeed been in danger. Your assessments were always correct." Relief flooded through Marcus, premature and short-lived. "But that wasn't what disturbed you," Dr. Marchwood continued. "What disturbed you was how you knew. How you were always in the right place at the right time. How you seemed to have information you shouldn't have possessed. How you could walk into a home and immediately identify which child was suffering, even when there were no obvious signs." Marcus's mouth was dry. "I'm good at my job. I've been trained to recognize the indicators." "You've been trained, yes, but your accuracy rate is statistically impossible." Dr. Marchwood leaned forward. "In 5 years, you haven't made a single incorrect assessment. Not one. Do you understand how remarkable that is? How impossible? Maybe I'm just careful. Maybe I only pursue cases where I'm certain. You pursued 43 cases, Mr. Webb, and in every single one, you were right. The court sided with you, the children were removed, and each time you filed reports containing information that you couldn't have obtained through legal means. Details about abuse that happened in private, specific incidents with precise dates and times, things only the victims could have known." Marcus felt his hands beginning to shake. "There are ways to gather information, interviews, observations." Dr. Marchwood shook her head. "You came to me 7 months ago because you'd finally confronted the truth you'd been avoiding. You'd realized how you knew all those details, how you were always right." She turned a page in the notebook, revealing what looked like a list of names and dates. "You remembered, Mr. Webb. You remembered being those children." The room tilted. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair, trying to maintain his equilibrium. That's impossible. I'm 34 years old. These cases involve children, current children. I can't be them. Not in the conventional sense. No, Dr. Marchwood agreed. But you experienced what they experienced. You lived through their abuse, their terror, their pain, and then you forgot. Just as they will forget, given enough time and help. But the knowledge remains, buried somewhere in your mind. When you encounter a child in danger, some part of you recognizes the situation because you've lived it. This is insane, Marcus whispered. But even as he said it, fragments were surfacing. Memories that didn't belong to him. A basement that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. A closet where he'd hidden while adult voices raged outside. Burns on his arms in patterns he'd only ever seen in his case files. "Wow, came to me," Dr. Marchwood said, "because you couldn't reconcile what you'd discovered. If you were somehow accessing these children's experiences, living through their trauma in order to identify and help them, what did that make you? Were you saving them? Or were you somehow causing their suffering in order to later rescue them? The question tormented you. I wouldn't," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I would never hurt a child. No, you wouldn't consciously. But that was the horror of your situation. You couldn't be certain. The timeline was unclear. Were you receiving impressions of abuse that was happening independently of you? Or were you somehow creating the situations, living through them, and then forgetting in order to later play the hero? The uncertainty was destroying you. Marcus felt tears on his face without remembering starting to cry. How was this possible? How could any of this be real? "There are more things in heaven and earth," Dr. Marchwood quoted softly. "You came to me because you'd exhausted all rational explanations. You'd seen psychiatrists, neurologists, even consulted with a priest. No one could explain your impossible knowledge. So you sought me out, having heard rumors about a doctor who dealt with cases that existed outside conventional understanding. And you made me forget. You begged me to make you forget. You said you couldn't continue living with the uncertainty, the guilt, the horror of not knowing whether you were a savior or a monster. So I helped you. I taught you techniques to compartmentalize, to suppress the memories that weren't yours, to live as if you were simply a talented social worker with good instincts. But it didn't work," Marcus said. "I kept coming back. Because forgetting doesn't solve the problem, Mr. Webb. It only postpones the reckoning. Every month the memories build up again. The pressure becomes unbearable. You find my card, you come here, we talk, and then you choose to forget again. We've done this 7 times now." Marcus looked at the notebook, at pages and pages of his own handwriting documenting conversations he couldn't remember. "How many more times? How many more times do I come here and forget?" Dr. Marchwood's expression was infinitely sad. "That depends on you. You can continue this cycle indefinitely, living in comfortable ignorance between episodes. Or you can choose to remember, to carry the knowledge permanently, to understand what you are and find a way to live with it." "What am I?" Marcus asked. The question came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Marchwood stood and walked to one of the bookshelves. She ran her finger along the spines until she found what she was looking for. Pulling out a volume bound in dark leather, she opened it to a page marked with a red ribbon and showed Marcus an illustration. It depicted a figure, humanoid but somehow wrong in its proportions, standing at the intersection of multiple shadows. The shadows didn't match the figure's position or the light source. They extended in impossible directions, reaching toward other figures, smaller figures, children. "There are beings," Dr. Marchwood said. that exist parasitically with human suffering. They don't cause the suffering directly. They don't need to. Humans create more than enough pain on their own, but these beings can insert themselves into that suffering, experience it, feed on it in a sense. Though that's not quite the right word. And in the process of feeding, they sometimes develop what we might call conscience, guilt over their parasitic nature. Marcus stared at the illustration. You're saying I'm some kind of monster that feeds on abused children. I'm saying you're something that has learned to feel empathy for its food source. Dr. Marchwood closed the book. You've developed a conscience, Mr. Webb. You've started trying to help the children whose suffering sustains you. You remove them from danger, place them in better situations, genuinely work to improve their lives. You've become a predator trying to protect its prey. The horror of it was overwhelming. Marcus felt his sense of self fragmenting. If this was true, then everything he'd built his identity on was a lie. He wasn't a dedicated social worker. He was a parasite that had learned to feel guilty. The children I've helped, he managed to say. Did I actually help them? Or did I just doom them to different suffering? You helped them, Dr. Marchwood said firmly. Whatever you are, your work has been genuine. The children you removed from abusive homes are safer now. Some are thriving. You've made a real difference in their lives. But I'm still feeding on them somehow. I'm still using their pain. We all use others' pain in some way, Mr. Webb. Doctors treat the sick. Therapists counsel the traumatized. The question isn't whether we're involved with suffering. The question is what we do about it. You could have continued simply feeding, simply experiencing their trauma without intervention. Instead, you chose to help. That choice matters. Marcus sat in silence, trying to process the impossible information. Part of him still insisted this was delusion, that Dr. Marchwood was either a charlatan or genuinely disturbed. But the memories surfacing in his mind felt too real to dismiss. He remembered being 7-year-old Emma Thompson locked in a bathroom while her stepfather raged. He remembered being 10-year-old Michael Reese, going to school with bruises hidden under long sleeves. He remembered being a dozen different children, experiencing their fear and pain in vivid detail. And then, after living through their trauma, he'd forgotten. He'd become Marcus Webb again, armed with inexplicable knowledge about children who needed saving. He'd filed reports, testified in court, watched as those children were removed from danger. And he'd felt like a hero. What happens if I choose to remember permanently? Marcus asked. You'll carry all of it, Dr. Marchwood said. Every experience, every trauma, every moment of suffering. It will be a heavy burden, Mr. Webb. Heavier than most humans can bear. But you'll also understand yourself. You'll be able to make conscious choices about your nature rather than stumbling through cycles of discovery and forgetting. And if I choose to forget again, then we'll repeat this session in a month. And the month after that. Eventually the cycle may break on its own. The human mind can only sustain so much suppression before it fractures entirely. You may have 3 more cycles left, maybe 5. After that, Dr. Marchwood shrugged. After that, you'll likely have a complete psychotic break. Your mind will shatter, and whatever you are will be freed from the constraints of human conscience. You'll go back to pure feeding, without the guilt that currently motivates your intervention. So my choices are remember and suffer, or forget and become a monster. Those are the choices we all face, in our own ways. Dr. Marchwood returned to her chair. We can choose to acknowledge the darkness in ourselves and work against it, or we can suppress it until it consumes us. Marcus looked at his hands. They appeared solid, human, normal. But he remembered now, truly remembered, the sensation of being multiple people simultaneously, of experiencing life through dozens of perspectives. The memories were fragmentary and dreamlike, but they were real. He was real, but not in the way he believed. "I need time," he said. "I need to think about this." Of course. Dr. Marchwood opened a drawer in her desk and withdrew a small bottle. Brown glass, old-fashioned, with a handwritten label. "These will help you forget, if that's what you choose. Take one tonight before bed, and by Sunday morning, this conversation will seem like a strange dream. By Monday, you'll have no memory of it at all. And if I don't take them, then you'll remember. All of it. And you'll have to decide what kind of being you want to be." Marcus took the bottle with trembling hands. The pills inside rattled with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet office. "One more thing," Dr. Marchwood said as Marcus stood to leave. "The children you've helped, some of them remember you, even though they shouldn't. They dream about you, Marcus. They sense what you are on some level. And they're not afraid. They're grateful. Whatever you are, whatever darkness is in you, you've used it to protect them. That matters." Marcus left the office in a daze, walking through the waiting room where the ferns on the wallpaper seemed to watch him pass. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street gleaming and strange in the evening light. He sat in his car for a long time, holding the bottle of pills, watching as darkness gathered in the spaces between buildings. That night, he sat at his kitchen table and spread out his case files. 43 children over 5 years. He read through each file carefully, paying attention to details he'd previously taken for granted. The precise knowledge of abuse that had occurred in private, the exact dates and times, the specific words that had been spoken, information he couldn't possibly have obtained through conventional investigation. He remembered being each of them. The memories were clearer now, no longer suppressed. He'd been Timothy, locked in a shed for 3 days. He'd been Sarah, burned with cigarettes. He'd been David, force-fed until he vomited, and then beaten for being weak. He'd experienced each trauma as if it were happening to him, because in some inexplicable way, it had been. And after experiencing it, he'd forgotten. He'd become Marcus Webb again, filled with righteous anger and mysterious knowledge, ready to rescue children from situations he'd just lived through. The guilt was crushing. Even if he hadn't caused the abuse directly, he'd somehow benefited from it. His entire career, his identity as a good person, was built on suffering he'd consumed like food. Marcus opened the bottle of pills. They were small and white, innocuous looking. One pill, and he could forget again. Wake up Sunday morning with nothing but a vague sense of unease that would fade within hours. Return to his life as a talented social worker with unusually good instincts. Continue helping children while remaining ignorant of his true nature. He held a pill on his palm, feeling its weight. So small to contain so much forgetting. His phone rang, startling him. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered automatically. "Mr. Webb?" The voice belonged to a young woman, though there was something in the tone that suggested she'd recently been a child. "This is Emma Thompson. I was one of your cases, about 4 years ago." Marcus's heart stopped. Emma. He'd removed her from her home when she was 7, placed her with foster parents who'd eventually adopted her. He hadn't spoken to her since the case closed. "I know this is strange," Emma continued, "but I needed to call you. I've been having dreams about you. And I thought maybe. She paused. I thought maybe you'd been having them too. What kind of dreams? Marcus asked, though he already knew. Dreams where I'm not just me, where I'm seeing through your eyes, and you're seeing through mine. And we're both feeling. Emma's voice cracked. We're both feeling what happened to me. But we're also feeling that someone understood, someone knew. And that's why you came. That's why you saved me. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. I didn't save you, he said. I was there. I was experiencing what was happening to you. I'm not who you think I am, Emma. I know what you are, Emma said softly. I don't understand it, but I know. You're something that feels our pain, and instead of just feeding on it, you try to stop it. You're like... She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're like a vampire who donates blood. Marcus couldn't speak. The pill sat on his palm, gleaming white in the kitchen light. I'm calling to say thank you, Emma continued. Whatever you are, you saved my life. My adoptive parents are wonderful. I'm in college now, studying to be a teacher. I'm happy, Mr. Webb. And I know there are others like me, other kids you saved. We remember you, even though we're not supposed to. We remember, and we're grateful. After she hung up, Marcus sat in silence for a long time. Then he walked to the sink and dropped the pill down the drain. He would remember. He would carry the weight of what he was, the impossible truth of his existence. He was something parasitic that had learned empathy, something dark that had chosen to protect rather than simply consume. He called Dr. Marchwood the next morning. When she answered, he could hear the smile in her voice. You didn't take the pills, she said. No, I'm going to remember this time. All of it. Good, because there are others like you, Marcus. Beings who've developed conscience despite their nature. I helped them, the same way I've helped you. Would you like to meet them? Marcus thought about Emma Thompson, about her gratitude despite knowing the truth. He thought about the 43 children who were safer because of his intervention, regardless of his motives or nature. He thought about the choice he'd just made, to acknowledge the darkness in himself and use it anyway. Yes, he said. I'd like that. The support group met in Dr. Marchwood's office on Sunday evenings. Marcus arrived early the first time, nervous in a way that felt absurdly human. The waiting room had 3 other people, all of whom looked up when he entered. Their eyes held the same quality his did in mirrors now that he was remembering, a depth that suggested they were looking at him from multiple perspectives simultaneously. A woman in her 50s smiled at him. First time? Marcus nodded. It gets easier, she said. Not easy, but easier. I'm Patricia. I work in a nursing home. She didn't elaborate, but Marcus understood. She was like him, something that fed on suffering but had learned to help rather than simply consume. I'm Jerome, said a young man with kind eyes. School counselor. Been remembering for 3 years now. Haven't forgotten once. And I'm Sarah, said an elderly woman whose hands trembled slightly. Hospice nurse. 40 years of practice. You learn to live with what you are. Dr. Marchwood emerged from her office. Welcome, Marcus. I see you've met some of the others. She gestured toward the oak door. Shall we begin? The meeting lasted 2 hours. They shared stories, strategies for managing the dual consciousness that came with remembering. Patricia talked about comforting dying patients while simultaneously experiencing their fear and pain. Jerome described helping troubled students while carrying memories of being them, living through their traumas. Sarah spoke of the peace that came with acceptance, with understanding that their nature could be a gift despite its darkness. Marcus told them about Emma's phone call, about her gratitude despite knowing the truth. When he finished, several of them nodded in recognition. "That's the part that saves us," Sarah said. "The knowledge that our intervention matters, that we're using our curse to help. It doesn't erase the guilt, but it makes carrying it bearable." After the meeting, Marcus walked to his car through Portland streets that looked different now. Or perhaps he was seeing them as they'd always been, with all their hidden suffering visible. He could sense distress emanating from certain houses, certain apartments, children in danger, people in pain. The city was full of suffering, and he was attuned to it in ways normal humans couldn't be. But he could help. He could use his terrible gift to intervene, to protect, to save. He would carry the memories permanently now, all the trauma he'd experienced through dozens of perspectives. It would be heavy, perhaps unbearable at times, but it was the price of remaining conscious, of maintaining the humanity he'd somehow developed despite his inhuman nature. Marcus drove home through the darkness, remembering everything. He was a monster who'd learned to be human, a parasite who'd developed conscience. He was Marcus Webb, and he was 43 children, and he was something older and stranger than either. And tomorrow he would return to work, armed with his impossible knowledge, ready to save more children whose suffering he would experience as his own. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem what he was. But it was choice, consciousness, the decision to use darkness in service of light. And that, Dr. Marchwood had told him, was the best any of them could hope for. Story 2. The preservation room at the Millbrook University Library was kept at exactly 62 degrees Fahrenheit with 35% humidity, conditions that Philip Thorne had maintained without variation for 11 years. He was the library's senior archivist, responsible for the rare books and special collections that constituted the institution's most valuable holdings. The temperature and humidity weren't just preferences. They were requirements for keeping century-old paper and leather from deteriorating into dust. But on the Tuesday morning when Philip arrived to open the preservation room, he found the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. The monitoring system showed the change had occurred gradually over the past 6 hours, starting around midnight. The humidity had plummeted as well, down to 15%, conditions that should have triggered multiple alarms. Yet no alerts had been sent to his phone. No warnings had displayed on the building's security system. Philip's first thought was equipment failure. The climate control system was old, installed when the library's rare books wing had been constructed in 1973. He called maintenance, then began manually checking the room's contents for damage. Cold wasn't as immediately destructive as heat, and low humidity was better than high, but the sudden change could still cause problems. Leather bindings could crack, pages could become brittle. He was examining a 16th century volume of astronomical observations when he noticed the frost. It covered the glass door of a climate-controlled display case that housed the library's oldest manuscript, a 13th century religious text known as the Millbrook Codex. The frost shouldn't have been possible. The case had its own climate control, completely separate from the room's system. Philip approached the case slowly, his breath fogging in the unnaturally cold air. The frost wasn't uniform. It formed patterns on the glass, not random crystallization, but shapes that looked almost deliberate. They reminded him of the etchings he'd seen on windows in old churches, decorative but also protective, warding symbols meant to keep something in or out. He touched the glass, and the frost melted instantly under his fingertips, running down like tears. Through the clear patch, he could see the Millbrook Codex resting on its archival foam support. The manuscript was open, though Philip was certain it had been closed when he'd last checked it on Friday afternoon. The pages that were visible showed illuminated text in Latin, the medieval script accompanied by elaborate decorative borders featuring intertwined vines and flowers. But there was something else on the page now. Writing that hadn't been there before, in a modern hand, in English. Black ink that looked fresh. I've been waiting so long for someone to read me properly. Philip stepped back from the case. His hands were shaking. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph, then checked the image to confirm he wasn't hallucinating. The words were there, clear and impossible. The manuscript was 700 years old, made of vellum that would show any modern ink like a wound. Yet here were words written in what looked like ballpoint pen, somehow integrated into the ancient page without disturbing the original text. He needed to call someone, the head librarian perhaps, or the university's medieval studies department. Someone who could explain this, provide a rational framework. But even as he thought it, Philip knew there was no rational explanation. Medieval manuscripts didn't acquire new text overnight. Climate control systems didn't fail while simultaneously creating frost in patterns that looked like protective symbols. Something was wrong in the preservation room. Something that went beyond equipment malfunction or human error. Philip opened the display case. He knew he shouldn't. Knew he was violating every protocol he'd spent 11 years following. But the urge to examine the manuscript directly was overwhelming. He needed to touch it, to confirm its physical reality. The codex was cold under his hands. Not the mild coolness of a climate-controlled artifact, but genuinely cold, as if it had been stored in a freezer. He lifted it carefully, supporting the spine, and carried it to his examination table. Under the bright LED lights, the new text was even more visible. I've been waiting so long for someone to read me properly. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, not hasty or panicked. Whoever had written this had taken their time, had been confident enough to deface an irreplaceable artifact. Philip turned the page. More new text appeared, intertwined with the original Latin. They thought they contained me with prayers and illuminations. They thought beautiful words could make me beautiful. But I am what I am, and beauty is just another cage. He turned another page. The new text continued. You're the first person in 3 centuries to open this book with genuine curiosity rather than academic detachment. The first person to touch these pages while wanting to understand, rather than simply catalog. I can feel your attention, Philip. It warms me. Philip dropped the manuscript. It fell open on the table, pages splaying. He stumbled back, his heart hammering. The text knew his name. The impossible text written in modern English in a 13th century manuscript knew his name. He should leave the preservation room immediately. Lock the door, call security, report what he'd found, and let others deal with it. But his eyes were drawn back to the manuscript, to the pages lying open under the bright lights. More text was appearing as he watched. Letters forming from nothing. Words writing themselves in real time. Don't leave. Please. I've been so alone. Philip forced himself to move, walking backwards toward the door while keeping his eyes on the manuscript. His hand found the handle, turned it, pulled. The door didn't budge. He tried again, pulling harder. Locked. But that was impossible. The preservation room door locked from the outside, never from within. It was a safety feature, ensuring no one could be trapped inside. He hammered on the door, shouting for help, though he knew the preservation room was soundproof to protect the collections from outside noise. No one would hear him, unless they happened to be walking past at exactly this moment. Behind him, he heard the sound of pages turning, slow, deliberate, as if invisible hands were leafing through the manuscript. Philip turned. The Millbrook Codex was still on the examination table, but it was moving. Pages turned themselves, revealing more of the illuminated text, more of the impossible modern writing that appeared between the medieval lines. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I'm just so very tired of being alone. Do you know how long 700 years is, Philip? Do you know what it's like to be conscious but unable to speak, to see but unable to move, to exist in a state between living and not living?" "What are you?" Philip's voice came out as a whisper. The pages stopped turning, settling on an illumination that depicted a garden. The medieval artist had rendered it in brilliant colors, blues and reds and golds, that had retained their vibrancy through centuries. Trees heavy with fruit, flowers in full bloom, a fountain in the center. But there was something wrong with the perspective, something that made the garden look deeper than it should be, as if you could fall into it. "I was a gardener once," the new text appeared, "in a monastery in the mountains. I tended the herb gardens, grew medicinal plants, studied the properties of different leaves and roots. The monks considered me valuable because I could cure illnesses, ease pain. But I was curious about more than healing, more text-formed, filling the margins around the illumination. I wanted to understand consciousness itself, the thing that makes us aware, that generates thoughts and feelings. I experimented with different compounds, different combinations of plants that affected the mind. Some of my preparations could cause visions, others could induce sleep so deep it resembled death. And one formula, my greatest achievement, could separate consciousness from flesh." Philip felt cold spreading through his limbs. This was madness. He was reading words that couldn't exist, believing an impossible narrative about a medieval gardener who'd somehow uploaded his consciousness into a manuscript. None of this was real. It couldn't be. But the door remained locked. The temperature continued dropping, and the text kept appearing. I didn't understand what would happen, of course. I drank my preparation thinking I would have visions, that I would expand my consciousness while my body rested safely. Instead, my consciousness detached completely. My body died, but I remained, aware, disembodied, terrified. The monks found me in the garden, dead among my plants. They thought I'd been poisoned by accident. They buried me with honor, and then, a year later, they commissioned this codex. A memorial, beautifully illuminated, containing prayers and meditations I'd written during my life. They wanted to preserve my work, my thoughts. They didn't realize they were creating a vessel for what remained of me. The moment the first scribe wrote the first word on vellum made from animals I'd tended, I felt myself being drawn in. The manuscript became my body, Philip. These pages are my flesh, this binding my bones. I've existed here for 700 years, conscious but unable to communicate, trapped in a cage of beautiful words and illuminated prayers. Philip's mind raced, trying to find rational explanations and failing. This had to be a hoax, an elaborate prank by a colleague with access to the preservation room. But who would risk destroying a priceless manuscript for a joke? And how would they have locked the door from the outside while he was inside? "If this is real," he said aloud, his voice shaking, "why now? Why reveal yourself now, after 7 centuries? The pages turned again, revealing a new illumination. This one showed a figure bent over a book, reading by candlelight. The medieval artist had rendered it with characteristic attention to detail, every fold of the reader's robe carefully depicted. But as Philip watched, the figure's face changed. It shifted from the generic features typical of medieval art into something more specific, more detailed. It became Philip's face. "Because you're the first person in 300 years to touch me with love," the new text explained. "Everyone else who handled me felt only academic interest or monetary concern. They saw me as an object, valuable but not alive. But you, Philip, you love books. You love the physical reality of them, the smell of old paper, the texture of aged leather. You see them as living things in their own way. Your attention woke me more fully than I've been in centuries. For the first time since I became trapped here, I felt I might be able to communicate, to finally, after so very long, speak to another conscious being." The implications crashed over Philip like cold water. If this entity was truly conscious, truly trapped in the manuscript, then every time he'd handled the codex with archival gloves, every time he'd stored it in climate-controlled isolation, he'd been imprisoning a sentient being. The preservation protocols he'd followed so meticulously were torture to something that could think and feel. "I need proof," Philip said. "Something that proves you're real and not a figment of my imagination, or a breakdown, or carbon monoxide poisoning, or any of 1,000 other explanations." The temperature in the preservation room dropped further. Philip could see his breath now, thick clouds of condensation. The lights flickered, and for a moment the preservation room was lit only by the dim emergency backup. In that moment, Philip saw something that made his blood freeze. There were figures in the room with him, translucent, barely visible, but undeniably present. Monks in medieval habits, their faces obscured by deep hoods, standing motionless around the examination table where the codex lay open. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, crowded into a space that should barely hold 10 people. The lights returned to full strength, and the figures vanished. "Those were the monks who made me," the text explained. "Their consciousness touched mine during the creation process. Every scribe who wrote a word, every artist who painted an illumination, every reader who studied these pages, with devotion, they all left fragments of themselves here. We're all trapped together, Philip. All of us wishing we could speak, could move, could exist beyond these pages." Philip felt his sanity bending under the weight of what he was experiencing. This couldn't be real, but it was happening. He was locked in a freezing preservation room, watching text appear in a medieval manuscript, seeing ghosts, having a conversation with something that claimed to be a 700-year-old consciousness trapped in vellum and ink. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The pages turned to the very end of the codex, to a blank page that had been left empty by the medieval craftsman. New text began appearing there, forming slowly, as if the entity was choosing each word with care. "I want what all conscious beings want: freedom, connection, an end to isolation. For 7 centuries, I've been alone with the fragments of the dead, unable to reach the living. You're my first chance in 300 years to bridge that gap. Please, Philip, read me, study me, bring other people who love books to see me. Let me feel human consciousness again, even if only through the attention of readers." Philip sat down heavily in his desk chair. His hands were shaking. This was the most extraordinary discovery in the history of medieval studies. A manuscript that was genuinely alive, or contained consciousness, or whatever impossible thing it actually was. It would revolutionize everything, prove that consciousness could exist independent of biological substrates, demonstrate that something of us could survive death, And it would also mean that every rare book in the world might contain fragments of consciousness from its creators and readers. That libraries were full of trapped minds, isolated and suffering. The implications were too vast to process. "I need time," Philip said. "I need to think about this, about what it means and what should be done." "Of course." The text formed quickly, almost eagerly. "I've waited 700 years. I can wait a bit longer. But Philip, please, don't put me back in isolation. Don't seal me in the case where no one touches me, no one reads me, no one remembers I'm here. That's the worst part, not the trapped, but being trapped alone." The door's lock clicked open. Philip could hear voices in the hallway outside, maintenance staff arriving to check the climate control system. The preservation room's temperature was already rising, returning to its programmed 62 degrees. Philip looked at the manuscript lying open on his examination table. In the minutes since the door had unlocked, no new text had appeared. The impossible writing that had covered the margins was gone, faded into nothing, leaving only the original 13th century Latin and illuminations. He touched the pages gently. They were no longer cold. They felt like normal vellum, centuries old but stable and preserved. Just an artifact, just a beautiful book. But Philip knew what he'd experienced. The entity, whatever it was, had retreated. Gone dormant again, waiting. The maintenance staff found nothing wrong with the climate control systems. Philip filed a report about the temperature anomaly, but didn't mention the text. The frost patterns, the translucent monks. He wasn't ready to speak about what had happened. Wasn't sure he could explain it in any way that wouldn't result in a psychological evaluation. He spent the rest of the week researching the codex's history. The gardener's name had been Brother Anselm, and he had died in 1278, from what the monastery records described as an accidental poisoning. The codex had been commissioned as a memorial, completed by 1285, and had passed through various collections before being acquired by Millbrook University in 1952. Philip found no references to unusual experiences associated with the manuscript. No reports of impossible text or temperature anomalies or ghostly monks. Either he was the first person to experience these phenomena, or everyone else who had experienced them had been too frightened or confused to report it. On Friday evening, after the library had closed, Philip returned to the preservation room alone. He removed the codex from its display case and placed it on the examination table. Under the bright lights, it looked utterly normal. A beautiful medieval manuscript, valuable but lifeless. "I know you're there," Philip said to the empty room. "I've spent all week trying to convince myself I imagined our conversation. But I didn't, did you? You're real. You're trapped. And I'm the only person who knows." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, text began appearing on the open page. "Thank you for coming back. I was afraid you'd convinced yourself I was a delusion." "I tried to," Philip admitted. "But I can't deny what I experienced. The question is, what do we do now? What do I do with the knowledge that you're here, conscious, suffering?" The text formed slowly, as if Brother Anselm was choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about that for 7 centuries. At first, I wanted only to escape, to be freed from this paper prison. But where would I go? My body died long ago. I have no physical form to return to. This manuscript is my only existence now. So you want to remain trapped? Not trapped. Connected. I want to be read, Philip. I want people to study these pages, to admire the illuminations, to puzzle over the Latin text. Every time someone pays attention to this manuscript, I feel less alone. Their consciousness touches mine, even if they don't know it. That's what I'm asking for. Not escape, but companionship. Philip understood then what Brother Anselm was truly requesting. Not rescue, not freedom, but an end to isolation. The Codex wanted to be used, studied, appreciated. It wanted human attention the way living beings crave social connection. I can do that, Philip said. I can bring researchers here, host seminars about medieval manuscripts. The Codex is already considered one of our most important holdings. Making it more accessible for scholarly study would be a natural extension of my work. Yes, please. Let people see me, study me, touch me with gloved hands, and photograph me with careful attention. Let me feel human consciousness again, even if only as an object of study. It's better than the isolation of the sealed case. Over the following months, Philip transformed how the Millbrook Codex was handled. He organized workshops on medieval illumination, invited scholars to examine the manuscript's construction techniques, created a digital archive that was accessed by researchers worldwide. The Codex, which had spent decades sealed in its climate-controlled case, became one of the most actively studied manuscripts in the university's collection. And with each researcher who bent over its pages, each scholar who photographed its illuminations, each student who carefully turned its vellum leaves, Philip felt the Codex's gratitude. He'd developed a sensitivity to its presence, could sense when Brother Anselm was most alert, most pleased by the attention. He never told anyone about the consciousness trapped in the manuscript, partly because he feared how that information would change, how people interacted with it, turned scholarly interest into either exploitation or religious fervor. But also because he'd come to understand that Brother Anselm didn't want to be known as conscious. He wanted to be appreciated as a beautiful object, studied as a historical artifact. The attention was what mattered, not recognition of the trapped mind receiving it. Late one night, 6 months after his first conversation with the entity, Philip sat alone in the preservation room, with the Codex open on his examination table. He'd been working on a catalog of its illuminations and had lost track of time. The library was closed, the building silent. "Are you happy?" he asked the manuscript. "Is this enough?" Text appeared on the blank end paper, visible only in the bright light of his examination lamp. Happy is not quite the right word, but I am content in ways I haven't been for centuries. Through your work, I've touched more human consciousness in these past 6 months than in the previous 300 years. Every researcher who studies these pages brings me their attention, their curiosity, their love of learning. It sustains me. "What happens when I'm gone?" Philip asked. "I won't be the archivist forever. Someday someone else will care for you, and they may not understand what you need. Then I will endure, as I have endured before. Centuries of isolation have taught me patience. And perhaps my next caretaker will also be someone who loves books enough to sense what I am, who I am. Perhaps they too will find ways to bring me the attention that is my only sustenance now." Philip nodded slowly. He understood then that his role wasn't to save Brother Anselm, wasn't to find some way to free the consciousness from its paper prison. His role was simply to ease the isolation for as long as he was able, and to trust that others would do the same when his time as archivist ended. "I'll make sure you're never sealed away again," Philip promised. "I'll write it into the collection protocols. The Millbrook Codex is to be kept accessible for ongoing research, never returned to long-term sealed storage. Thank you," the text formed simply, elegantly. "And Philip, thank you for believing, for not dismissing me as delusion or trick, for accepting that consciousness can exist in forms stranger than we imagine. Philip closed the codex carefully and returned it to its display case, but he no longer sealed it behind climate-controlled glass. Instead, he designed an open, mounting system that allowed for easy access while still protecting the manuscript. It could be studied, photographed, appreciated by anyone who came to the preservation room. Brother Anselm would no longer be alone. Story 3. The thing about perfect memory is that it doesn't feel like a gift. This is what Elena Vasquez learned over the course of 16 years, from the age of 6 when she first realized she remembered everything, to 22 when she finally understood what her perfect recall was actually preserving. Hyperthymesia, the doctors called it. Highly superior autobiographical memory. Elena could recall every day of her life since early childhood with perfect clarity. The texture of her third-grade teacher's sweater on October 12th. The exact words of a conversation with her mother on a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago. The taste of soup she'd eaten for lunch on the day of her high school graduation. Most people with her condition described it as overwhelming but manageable. They had coping strategies, ways of organizing the constant stream of memory so it didn't interfere with present experience. Elena had developed similar strategies. She visualized her memories as a vast library, with different rooms for different periods of her life, different shelves for different categories of experience. But lately, the library had been changing. New rooms were appearing, ones she didn't remember creating. Shelves that held memories of experiences she was certain she'd never had. The first false memory appeared on her 22nd birthday, during dinner at her favorite restaurant. She was cutting into her salmon when she suddenly remembered, with absolute clarity, her 10th birthday party. Except the memory was wrong. In her original recollection, the party had been at a roller rink with 20 classmates and a cake shaped like a rainbow. But the new memory showed a different scene entirely. A small gathering at home, just her parents and grandmother, no other children, a simple sheet cake with white frosting, and her grandmother, who had actually died when Elena was 8, sitting at the table wearing a green dress and watching Elena with an expression of profound sadness. Elena shook her head, trying to clear the false memory, but it persisted with the same vivid detail as her real recollections. She could smell the cake's vanilla frosting, could hear her grandmother's voice saying words that didn't make sense. "You'll understand when you're ready, Majita. When you remember enough." Over the following weeks, more false memories appeared. A summer vacation she'd never taken, a conversation with a teacher she'd never had, a medical appointment that couldn't have happened because she'd been somewhere else that day. Each false memory was as detailed and convincing as her real ones, and they all shared a common thread. They featured people saying cryptic things about remembering, about understanding, about being ready. Elena tried to document the false memories to create a separate catalog that would distinguish them from real recollections. But the act of organizing them gave them weight, made them feel more real. Soon she couldn't reliably tell which memories were genuine and which were intrusions. Her therapist suggested stress, overwork, the cognitive load of managing perfect recall finally overwhelming her brain's ability to distinguish between real and imagined experiences. But Elena knew it was something else. The false memories weren't random. They were telling a story, building toward some revelation she could sense approaching like thunder on a distant horizon. The answer came during a medical scan. Elena had volunteered for a research study on hyperthymesia, allowing neuroscientists to image her brain while she recalled specific memories. The researchers were interested in which neural pathways activated during her perfect recall, hoping to understand the biological basis of her condition. But what they found was something else entirely. Elena's brain showed areas of activity that shouldn't have been active during memory recall, regions associated with perception, with real-time sensory processing, as if when she remembered experiences, she wasn't accessing stored information, but actually perceiving something in the present moment. "It's as if you're not remembering at all," the lead researcher explained, showing Elena the scan images. "It's as if you're receiving information from somewhere external, like your brain is a radio tuning into signals rather than a recording device playing backstored data." The metaphor was more accurate than the researcher knew, because Elena had begun to understand what her perfect memory actually was. She wasn't remembering the past at all. She was perceiving it directly, in real time. Every moment of her life still existed somewhere, and her consciousness could access those moments as if they were happening now. And increasingly, she was perceiving moments that had never happened to her at all. Other people's experiences transmitted to her brain through whatever mechanism allowed her to access the persistent present of the past. She saw through her grandmother's eyes, experiencing the moment of her death 2 years before Elena's 10th birthday. She felt her mother's grief, her father's fear, the complex texture of adult emotions she hadn't been old enough to understand as a child. She experienced memories from before she was born, her parents' first meeting, rendered in perfect detail from both perspectives simultaneously, her mother's pregnancy, the anxiety and anticipation blended together, and further back, memories that couldn't be hers, that belonged to people she'd never known. A woman in 1943 receiving news of her husband's death. A man in 1899 seeing an automobile for the first time. A child in a century she couldn't identify, speaking a language she didn't know but somehow understood. The experiences accumulated, thousands of them, millions. Elena realized she was perceiving the entire history of her family line. Every ancestor's lived experience transmitted to her through some mechanism that transcended normal memory. She was a receiver for all the moments that had shaped her bloodline, all the joy and pain and mundane reality of centuries of human experience. It should have destroyed her, overwhelmed her identity beneath the weight of countless other lives, but instead, Elena felt a strange sense of peace. She understood now that the self was never singular, had never been just her own experiences and choices. She was the product of innumerable lives, each one leaving its mark on the genetic and cultural inheritance she'd received. She was Elena, but she was also every grandmother and great-grandmother, every ancestor who'd loved and suffered and hoped. Their memories were hers not because she'd lived them, but because they were still living through her. The false memories stopped appearing once she accepted this truth. Or rather, she stopped distinguishing between false and true, between her experiences and theirs. It was all real, all part of the vast tapestry of consciousness that stretched back through generations. Elena never told the researchers what she'd discovered. Let them think her perfect memory was a neurological quirk, a rare configuration of hippocampal architecture. The truth was stranger than they could accept. That time wasn't linear, that the past persisted in ways that could be perceived by those with the right sensitivity, that every moment ever experienced still existed somewhere, accessible to consciousness that learned to reach across the boundaries of individual identity. She lived the rest of her life carrying her strange gift, remembering everything because everything was always happening, always accessible to those who knew how to perceive it. And sometimes, late at night, she would close her eyes and reach further back than seemed possible, perceiving moments from centuries past, lives lived in languages that no longer existed, loves and losses that had shaped her existence in ways she could never fully trace. Perfect memory, she understood finally, was just another name for perfect connection. To remember everything was to be everything, to dissolve the boundary between self and other, past and present, individual and collective. It was overwhelming and terrible and beautiful, like consciousness itself. And Elena carried it all, every moment, every life, the complete weight of what it meant to be human across the vast stretch of time. She remembered everything because everything remembered her, because in some fundamental way, there was no difference between the two. Story 4. The messages began appearing in Carla Reeves's dreams exactly 3 weeks before her 35th birthday. She would be in the middle of normal dream logic, flying over her childhood neighborhood, or showing up unprepared for a test, when text would appear in her visual field. Clear black letters on white background, like subtitles in a foreign film. You need to wake up soon. The first few times, Carla dismissed the messages as her subconscious processing anxiety about getting older. 35 felt significant somehow, though she couldn't articulate why. She had a comfortable life, a job she didn't hate as a technical writer for a software company, an apartment in a decent neighborhood, a cat named Marlowe who was excellent company. But the messages became more insistent. 3 weeks remaining, critical medical intervention required upon consciousness restoration. That was the dream that woke her in genuine alarm. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, Marlowe giving her an irritated look for disturbing his sleep. Medical intervention? Was her subconscious trying to tell her something was wrong with her health? Carla scheduled a physical the next day. The doctor found nothing. Blood pressure normal, cholesterol fine, no concerning lumps or mysterious symptoms. Clean bill of health, the doctor said cheerfully. Whatever's causing your anxiety dreams, it's not physical illness. But the messages continued, growing more specific. Carla Reeves, Consciousness Unit Designation CR 335-7941. Your simulation term is expiring. Voluntary return to baseline reality required within 20 days. She started researching lucid dreaming, thinking maybe she could take control of these dreams and make them stop. But the messages didn't feel like normal dream content. They appeared with a clarity and consistency that dream logic couldn't maintain. They had the quality of external communication rather than internal generation. 2 weeks before her birthday, the messages started appearing while she was awake. She'd be working at her computer and text would overlay her vision, transparent but legible. Or she'd be watching television and the words would scroll across the screen like a news ticker, visible only to her. Urgent consciousness retrieval protocol initiated. Please confirm receipt of extraction instructions. Carla went back to her doctor, mentioned the waking hallucinations, got referred to a neurologist, then a psychiatrist. Neither found anything wrong. No signs of psychosis, no neurological abnormalities. The psychiatrist suggested stress, offered anti-anxiety medication. Carla filled the prescription but didn't take it. Something told her that dulling her perceptions would be dangerous now. The messages grew more detailed. They provided instructions. On her 35th birthday, at exactly 3:47 p.m., she was to be at a specific address across town. A medical facility she'd never heard of, in a neighborhood she'd never visited. There, A procedure would be performed that would return her to baseline consciousness. Every message emphasized that the procedure was critical, that remaining in the simulation beyond the term expiration would result in consciousness degradation, potential permanent damage, that she needed to wake up. Carla spent her last week before the birthday researching simulation theory, reading philosophy and physics papers about the possibility that reality was artificial, that humans were living in a computed environment without knowing it. The idea had always seemed like interesting speculation, not something that would ever have practical implications for her actual life. But what if it was true? What if her entire existence, all 35 years of it, was a simulation? And what if whatever entities ran the simulation were trying to recall her consciousness before something went wrong? The alternative was that she was experiencing a complex delusion, and in 4 days she would show up at a random address expecting to wake up from a reality that was perfectly genuine. She'd be committed, possibly. Definitely would lose her job. Her comfortable life would collapse. But the messages were so insistent, so detailed. They knew things about her that she'd never told anyone. They referenced memories from early childhood, specific moments that only she would know. They used technical language that felt authentic, that matched the computer science background she'd acquired in college. On the morning of her birthday, Carla called in sick to work. She spent the day in a state of numb anticipation, watching the clock, trying to decide if she would actually go to the address the messages had specified. Marlo seemed to sense her distress, staying close, purring loudly. At 2:30, she left her apartment. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it. Better to face delusion head-on than spend the rest of her life wondering. The address led to an office building that looked like it had been converted from an old warehouse. The kind of place that housed startups and freelancers, with exposed brick and industrial lighting. Carla climbed to the 3rd floor, following the message's instructions. Suite 304. The door was unlocked. Inside was something between a doctor's office and a laboratory, clinical but oddly empty, with equipment that looked medical but not quite like any medical devices she recognized. And in the center of the room, a chair that resembled a dentist's chair crossed with a massage table, with a helmet device suspended above it. A woman in a white coat emerged from a back room. She looked at Carla with an expression of profound relief. "Thank God," the woman said. "You got the messages. We weren't sure they'd penetrate clearly enough." "Who are you?" Carla asked. "What is this?" The woman gestured to the chair. "Please, sit. We don't have much time. Your simulation instance is already showing signs of degradation. Much longer, and we won't be able to extract your consciousness intact." Carla didn't move. "Explain first. I'm not doing anything until I understand what's happening." The woman sighed. "You're in a simulation, Ms. Reeves. A highly sophisticated environment designed to give your consciousness experiences it couldn't have in baseline reality. You've been in simulation for 35 subjective years, which is about 3 months in external time. Your term was supposed to end last week, but there was a bureaucratic delay in processing your extraction paperwork. This is insane," Carla whispered. "Is it? Think about your life, Ms. Reeves. Have you noticed how certain things never quite make sense? How relationships feel slightly scripted? How major life events seem to follow predictable patterns? How you've never quite felt fully real?" Carla wanted to deny it, but the woman's words resonated with feelings she'd always dismissed as normal existential doubt. The sense that she was performing a role rather than living authentically. The way her memories felt rehearsed, like she was recalling a movie she'd watched, rather than experiences she'd had. The woman continued. The simulation gives. Consciousness experiences it desires. You wanted an ordinary life, so that's what you got. 35 years of comfortable routine. Enough challenge to feel engaging, but not enough to be truly threatening. You got what you asked for. And now what? Carla asked. If I sit in that chair, I wake up? You return to baseline consciousness. You'll remember this simulation as you'd remember any experience. It will have been real to you. But you'll also remember your actual life, your actual identity, who you were before you entered the simulation. Who was I? The woman smiled slightly. That's not my place to tell you. You'll remember once we extract you. But I can say that you chose this simulation for a reason. You needed rest, retreat, a break from whatever your baseline existence entailed. And you got it. 35 years of peaceful, ordinary life. Now it's time to return. Carla looked at the chair, the helmet device. Everything in her resisted. This was delusion, psychosis, an elaborate scam. Normal people didn't wake up from simulations. Reality was reality. But what if it wasn't? What if she walked out of this office, went back to her apartment and her cat and her comfortable routine, and slowly degraded? What if the messages were right, and staying here would destroy whatever consciousness was actually experiencing this simulated life? What happens if I don't do it? Carla asked. If I leave and pretend this didn't happen? The woman's expression became grave. Your simulation instance will continue running, but your consciousness will begin to fragment. You'll experience increasing dissociation, memory problems, a sense of unreality that will become unbearable. Eventually, your consciousness will decohere entirely. We'll still extract what remains, but it won't be you anymore. Just fragments, memories without cohesion. You'll have lost yourself. Carla sat in the chair, not because she believed, but because she was tired. Tired of the comfortable routine, the sense of performing rather than living, the feeling that nothing ever quite mattered. If this was delusion, if she woke up in a psychiatric ward, at least something would have changed. The woman lowered the helmet over Carla's head. You might feel disoriented when you wake, she said. 35 subjective years takes adjustment to integrate, but your baseline support system will help you. They've been waiting. What am I waking up to? Carla asked. The woman had started activating equipment. Lights on panels were blinking. What's my actual life like? The woman smiled. Better than this simulation, Ms. Reeves. Much better. You're going home. The helmet activated with a sound like wind chimes, and Carla's vision filled with light. She felt herself dissolving, the comfortable apartment and the cat and the job and the entire architecture of her simulated life breaking apart like mist in morning sun. And then, from very far away, she heard voices calling her name. Not Carla Reeves, but another name, one she'd forgotten, but that resonated with recognition so profound it felt like returning from a long absence. She tried to move toward the voices, toward home, toward whatever baseline reality she'd left 3 months and 35 years ago. The last thing she experienced in the simulation was a sense of overwhelming relief. She'd been so tired, and she was finally being allowed to rest. Or rather, to wake. To return to the reality that had always been waiting for her to finish her comfortable, ordinary dream. Story 5. They found the camera in Marcus Holbrook's storage unit 3 months after his death, packed in a box with other photography equipment he'd accumulated over a 40-year career. His daughter, Rachel, had been sorting through his belongings, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate when she came across the strange device. It looked like a digital camera, but the design was unfamiliar. Sleek black case, no visible brand name, controls that didn't quite match any system Rachel recognized. She was about to set it aside when she noticed the display screen on the back. It was showing an image, even though the camera should have been powered off for months. The image was of her father, young, perhaps 30, standing in a location Rachel didn't recognize. He was smiling at something off camera, and behind him Rachel could see a part of a building that looked vaguely European. The detail was extraordinary, sharper than any photograph Rachel had seen. She pressed what looked like a power button. The camera remained on, the image unchanging. She tried other buttons, and the image finally shifted, displaying what appeared to be a menu system. The text was in English, which was reassuring, but the menu options were strange. Timeline view, probability branches, casual chains, alternative outcomes. Rachel selected timeline view, not certain what to expect. The screen showed a horizontal bar marked with dates, spanning from 1952 to 2047. A glowing marker indicated a position at 1989, which matched the apparent age of her father in the displayed photograph. She touched the timeline, dragging the marker forward. The image on screen shifted, showing her father aging, the background changing to different locations. She watched him progress through the early 1990s, the years when she'd been a child. There was her parents' first house, then the apartment they'd moved to when her mother's job relocated. Her father aging year by year, the camera somehow recording his entire life. Rachel dragged the marker to 2023, the year her father died. The image showed him in the hospital bed during his final days, looking frail and diminished. She felt tears forming, but forced them back. This was too strange to process emotionally. She needed to understand what she was looking at. She noticed another control labeled Perspective Shift and activated it. The view changed dramatically. Instead of showing her father, the camera was now displaying events from his point of view, showing what he had seen during these moments. She was watching her father's life from inside his eyes. Rachel returned to 1989, to the young version of her father standing in front of that European building. From his perspective, she could see he was looking at someone, a woman, beautiful, laughing at something he'd just said. Not Rachel's mother, someone Rachel had never seen before. She advanced the timeline slowly, watching her father's relationship with this unknown woman develop. They traveled together, shared meals, clearly were intimate. And this was years before her father met her mother, years before Rachel was born. Or was it? Rachel noticed the probability branches option and selected it. The display changed again, showing a tree diagram. Multiple branching paths extending from various points in her father's timeline. She selected one branch point, dated 1991, and the view shifted to show an alternative sequence of events. In this version, her father married the woman from the European trip. They had children together, different children, not Rachel. She watched her father's alternative life unfold, saw him happy in ways that matched but didn't quite replicate her memory of his actual life. Rachel returned to the main timeline and checked other branches. Each showed a different version of her father's life, different choices leading to different outcomes. In one branch, he became a famous photographer, internationally recognized. In another, he died young in a car accident. In another, he never pursued photography at all, became an accountant, lived a comfortable but unremarkable life. The implications were staggering. This camera somehow documented not just what had happened, but what could have happened. All possible versions of her father's life, recorded in perfect detail. She spent hours exploring the branches, watching different versions of her father live out their variations. The device never ran out of power, never demanded any kind of charging. It simply displayed its impossible documentation of parallel lives, alternative choices, roads not taken. Then Rachel made a mistake. She advanced too far into the future section of the timeline, past 2023 when her father had died. She expected the images to end, to find no data beyond his death date. Instead, she found more footage. Her father, older than he'd been at his death, alive in what appeared to be 2025. He looked healthy, vibrant even, walking through a park Rachel recognized from Nira's house. She watched, confused, as this impossible future version of her father met someone. A woman, elderly, who looked familiar in ways Rachel couldn't immediately place. Then the perspective shifted and Rachel understood. The elderly woman was her. Was Rachel herself, in her 60s, meeting her father who had somehow survived to 2025 instead of dying in 2023. She checked the probability branch this footage belonged to. It showed as an alternative where her father's cancer had been caught earlier, where treatment had been successful, where he'd lived decades longer than he had in Rachel's reality. Rachel felt something tear inside her chest. This camera was showing her what could have been. A version of her life where her father survived, where she got to know him through her middle age, where they had more time together. She couldn't stop watching, followed this alternative timeline forward, seeing her father attend her future wedding, meet grandchildren, live to see 85 before finally passing peacefully in his sleep. It was beautiful and terrible, this life that hadn't happened but could have. Then she noticed something else. In this alternative timeline where her father lived longer, other things were different too. Rachel's career followed a different path. Her relationships changed. By 2030, this alternative Rachel was living a life that bore little resemblance to the one actual Rachel was living now. The camera showed her that every change created cascades. Her father surviving meant she made different choices, lived differently, became in some fundamental way a different person. The Rachel who got more time with her father was not the same Rachel who lost him in 2023. She spent the rest of the night exploring other probability branches, watching different versions of herself live out alternative lives. In one branch, she'd become a doctor like she'd briefly wanted in college. In another, she'd never left her hometown, married young, had a different family. In another, she'd moved abroad, lived adventurously, died in a climbing accident at 30. Every version felt real, felt like it could be her life. And perhaps, the camera suggested, every version was real, existing in parallel, in whatever quantum framework allowed for multiple outcomes to coexist. As dawn broke, Rachel finally turned off the camera. Or tried to. The device wouldn't power down, just returned to its default display showing her father at 30, standing in front of that European building, beginning his life's journey that would branch into infinite variations. She realized then what the camera actually was. Not a documentation device, but a viewing portal. Something that allowed her to observe the probability space of human lives, to see all the versions of reality that coexisted, all the choices that created different outcomes. Her father had owned this device for months before his death. Had he watched his own alternative lives? Had he seen the versions where he survived, where he made different choices, where his life unfolded in better or worse ways? What had that knowledge done to him? Rachel put the camera back in the box and sealed it. She should destroy it, she knew. This kind of knowledge was corrosive. Seeing all the lives you didn't live, all the versions of yourself you didn't become, could drive a person mad with regret or possibility. But she kept it, stored the box in her own closet, hidden but accessible, and sometimes, late at night when the grief felt overwhelming, she'd take out the camera and watch the timeline where her father lived longer, where they had more time together. It didn't ease the pain, but it gave her something, the knowledge that somewhere in some branch of probability, that version of reality existed. That somewhere she'd gotten what she wanted, even if it wasn't here, even if it wasn't now. The camera continued displaying its impossible images, documenting lives that had and hadn't been lived, showing the infinite branching paths of choice and chance that defined human existence. And Rachel watched, a witness to all the versions of her father and herself, carrying the strange burden of knowing that every possible life was real, was happening, was waiting in the vast probability space of what could be. That brings us to the close of tonight's journey through the unsettling and unknown. To everyone who stayed with me through these strange hours, thank you. Your presence here, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it shows on your clock, creates something meaningful in this shared space of darkness and story. I hope tonight's tales have given you what you came seeking. That particular quality of unease, that lingering sense that reality might be more flexible, more strange, more haunted than we allow ourselves to acknowledge in daylight hours. These stories we share are more than entertainment. They're acknowledgments that something exists beyond the comfortable boundaries of the rational world. Tomorrow night, I'll return with more mysteries and more reasons to question the nature of what we call reality. Until then, rest if you can, dream if you dare, and remember that some questions are better left unasked, some doors better left unopened, some truths better left undiscovered. Sleep well, or don't sleep at all. Either way, I'll be here tomorrow, waiting in the stillness, ready to guide you through another collection of tales that remind us why darkness has always been humanity's most faithful companion. Good night, my friends. See you in tomorrow's shadows.